matter of tariffs, we see the idea of tariffs is not majority popular. You see majorities saying they would oppose new tariffs on Mexico, Europe, Canada, U.S. allies.
We're fully supportive of what the DOGE effort is doing and what the president is doing. It's a very aggressive agenda that was promised to the voters.
When you target civil servants, you also target the people they serve.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, there could be new tariffs. President Trump announces he's ready to slap tariffs of 25% on steel imports and promises that tariffs on aluminum is next. And there's a potential new trade war. Chinese counter tariffs are due to kick in. That will have economic consequences for all Americans and that trade relationship. Also, energetic. That's one way to describe the opening weeks of the Trump presidency. New CBS News polling shows Americans generally approve of Trump 2.0, but it's not all good news. A majority of those in our survey say the president is still, to their satisfaction, not doing enough to lower costs for Americans. And Gaza questions. The ceasefire in the Middle East appears to be on shaky ground. Meanwhile, the president, in a Fox News Super Bowl sit-down interview, talks about his plans for Gaza.
We'll build beautiful communities for the 1.9 million people. We'll build beautiful communities, safe communities.
We have a lot to get to tonight. I want to turn to Weijia Jiang on the North Lawn of the White House. So, Weijia, catch us up on where the tariff conversation currently stands.
Well, Major, we are waiting for President Trump to sign an executive order that would officially implement those 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminum that is imported to the United States. And that includes our North American allies, because the countries that export most of steel and aluminum to this country include Canada, Mexico, South Korea, Brazil, Vietnam. And so those are the countries that would be impacted the most. Separate from that, Major, the president says at some point this week he will also sign an executive order to issue retaliatory tariffs, basically retaliating on any country that imposes fees on U.S. exports. He says if they charge us, we'll charge them the same amount. So we're waiting for, of course, all the fine print and wording to see how that would work. But, you know, this is something he promised he would do, and now he's carrying out.
And Weijia, a federal judge in Boston this afternoon extended the pause on this deadline for federal workers to accept a proposed but yet unfunded buyout or early retirement offer from the administration.
That's right. So the judge actually imposed this deadline last week. It was supposed to be midnight on Thursday, but he gave it until midnight tonight for federal workers to make this decision while he heard the case from both sides, which happened today. And now he could extend that even more because he has not issued a ruling just yet. And until he does, that deadline is extended, which gives federal workers, I suppose, more time to mull over whether or not to take this offer. But at the crux of all of this is the legality of this order, which is what the judge heard today from both sides, the administration saying that they have every right to do this and promising that they'll be able to fulfill the financial obligation of this offer, which is to keep paying these federal workers until the end of September. Of course, the unions that are suing and the labor groups say, wait a minute, the budget actually expires or the funds run out on March 14th, so you can't promise you can pay somebody with funds that have not yet been appropriated. So that's really at the heart of this debate, and we are waiting for the judge to tell us what he thinks about it.
Weijia, one more topic, if you'll be so kind. In that interview with Fox News, the traditional Super Bowl interview with the broadcasting network, the president also described in greater detail his, at least, theory about how to redevelop Gaza. Let's take a listen.
We'll build safe communities a little bit away from where they are, where all of this danger is. In the meantime, I would own this. Think of it as a real estate development for the future. It would be a beautiful piece of land.
Would the Palestinians have the right to return?
Spent. No, they wouldn't, because they're going to have much better housing.
So 2 diplomatic tripwires to my ears, at least, Ouija. The president saying, I would own this and no right of return for Palestinians.
Right, Major. He has not explained what authority he has to take over a sovereign territory. He has not explained what authority he has to remove some 2 million Palestinians who call Gaza home and then say, hey, you can't come back. He has said in the past that after the war, Israel would turn over Gaza for the U.S. to develop. But Major, that's just 2 of many, many unanswered questions about the president's long-term plan here. He himself has said that it will take about 10 or 15 years to develop his vision for Gaza. And he's only president for the next 4. So the next president and the one after that would have to maintain this U.S. policy. And, that's really getting way ahead of where we ought to be, which is the phase of the ceasefire agreement that addresses the end of the war. And that is something we've heard very little about, Major, from President Trump and from Prime Minister Netanyahu, who was here at the White House to talk about this very thing. The war has to end before you talk about rebuilding Gaza. And right now, that ceasefire agreement seems to be falling apart, and we don't know under what conditions exactly the IDF would completely withdraw troops, and we don't know under what conditions Hamas would be willing to turn over the remaining hostages. And so for all this talk about rebuilding, Major, we have to take a step back and really look at the facts in front of us, which is there are no details to implement that agreement. And, President Trump has not answered what he plans to do. He's used a lot of threatening language, but, Major, we're still waiting to see how this all winds down, if it winds down.
If it winds down. A very good point. Ouija Zhang at the White House. Thank you so much. Staff within the Justice Department and FBI, it is fair to say, are on edge. Workers bracing for more firings due to the changes under the Trump administration. And more shakeups, well, they are expected as Pam Bondi's first full week as Attorney General begins. For insight, I want to turn to Scott McFarland. Scott, there was a report over this weekend that senior leaders in intelligence and at the FBI are now being asked questions.
Yeah, the scrutiny is broader than just FBI agents. The Department of Justice is staffing up with any number of new political appointees, and there may be some vacancies quite soon in the civil service if there's a purge going on. There's reporting that some of the questions being asked relate to, was January 6th a Fedsurrection?
An inside job.
An inside job, or was it real? To be clear, that'd be a question based on a conspiracy theory, not grounded in truth at all. But my latest reporting as we come on the air is that there is now growing concern about the fortunes and the fates of the dozens, maybe 150 assistant U.S. attorneys who were dispatched to Washington, D.C. to help prosecute the January 6 cases. There were so many cases so quickly, you'll recall, by the hundreds. They needed to bring in outside teams to help the finite number of prosecutors in Washington get through all the cases. So there are U.S. attorneys, assistant U.S. attorneys from other states, other regions who came here to help with the cases. There's concern they will be, at some point, either disciplined or retaliated against for having any nexus to January 6th. It's also worth mentioning federal defenders were brought in from across the country to defend some of these accused rioters, convicted rioters. They may be beyond scrutiny because they were defense attorneys, but it underscores something. This was such a big prosecution, historic in nature. It took outside help to manage it. Now some of those outside helpers are worried for their jobs.
It almost creates the idea, Scott, that doing this work, which in many cases the people you just described were assigned to do, has created a kind of a radioactivity for their entire future within the Justice Department.
I think fundamentally everything that has touched January 6th has been nitroglycerin. It has been poised to explode, whether you were the judges handling those cases, taking incoming death threats by the dozens. Whether you're a U.S. attorney or a prosecutor, somebody dispatched here to Washington or somebody based in Washington who had to handle the assignment you were given, you're menaced with threats, now facing retaliation. And these 5,000 FBI agents and employees who were part of the investigation have this cloud over their head, checking their emails every few minutes to see if they've been put on leave or been subject to termination. That is a distraction for agents who chase terrorists for a living. This is all metastasizing. There's an end date, presumably, to some of this, but right now it's an agency in turmoil, notwithstanding the changes at the top.
How does this flow through Pam Bondi as the new Attorney General?
So a whole new set of policies came out of Pam Bondi in her first week, and we'd expect more in the coming days. Among those first set of policy changes was reinstituting federal pursuit of the death penalty in some high-level criminal cases, a return-to-work policy to require those who aren't back in the office, wherever they are in the United States Justice Department, to come back to the office, which will have an impact on the number of employees they have in short order. What comes next? Hard to say, but we would expect a whole rollout of policy initiatives under the Attorney General because she has promised a sea change. She's promised to end weaponization of the Department of Justice, and she's going to have to perhaps broaden what she rolls out to make any of those things happen or to make a public show of it.
45 seconds. Rod Blagojevich, if you remember the Obama administration, he was a name to recall.
He was released from prison during COVID, or just before the COVID pandemic, which brings us back 5 years.
Former Illinois governor, yeah.
His supervision concluded in 2021. He has been a private citizen for some time now, but it sure does line up, doesn't it? As the early pardons all have some nexus to politics, be it January 6th or be it former office holders. Let's see what happens with the prosecution of Mayor Eric Adams in New York.
Pardon of Rod Blagojevich, possibly an ambassadorship in his future. Scott McFarland, always a pleasure. Thank you, sir. Now to the Middle East. Hamas says the next release of hostages, which was part of this elaborately negotiated ceasefire agreement, is now delayed because it says Israel is violating the very terms of that underlying ceasefire agreement. Lee Kinneary is tracking the latest and comes to us from Tel Aviv.
Here in Tel Aviv, that announcement that there may be further delay in bringing those hostages home who've already been held by Hamas for nearly 500 days is unacceptable. The feeling really is that now isn't even soon enough. There simply is no time to waste after the public watched in horror over the weekend as 3 male hostages were returned, looking emaciated and weak. They were in much worse condition than hostages we'd seen in previous weeks, and the concern is rising. Hamas, however, appeared strong, parading them on stage. And now they say the suspension of these exchanges is a reaction to Israel violating terms of the ceasefire. They say Israel's delayed some Palestinians from returning to their homes. They say that there have even been some targeted with gunfire, and that essential aid has been prevented from entering the Gaza Strip. Now, this ceasefire has been fragile. Though the bombing has stopped, 3 Palestinians were shot and killed this weekend. Israel said they got too close to the border and it was a protective measure. Now, Hamas did leave a door open with this new statement, saying they deliberately gave 5 days notice before the next scheduled hostage exchange so that mediators can help correct the alleged violations, namely letting more aid into the Gaza Strip. The next exchange is scheduled for Saturday, so we've so far seen 16 hostages released in this first phase of the agreement. But there are still more than 70 hostages in Gaza, including 2 who are American citizens believed to be alive. Israel's defense minister has said Hamas's announcement in itself is a violation of the ceasefire and has instructed his military to prepare at the highest level of readiness in Gaza. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has called a security cabinet meeting for Tuesday morning. Back to you.
Lee Kinneary in Tel Aviv, thank you very much. Challenging the president's power, that's on the minds of some Americans. More than 40 lawsuits have been filed against the Trump administration just so far. Next, we'll speak with the head of a group that is leading one of the charges by filing several different lawsuits. That's next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. Fact, President Trump isn't shy about anything, and since returning to the White House, he hasn't been shy about using executive powers through either executive orders or actions. Yet, some of those have been met with stiff legal challenges. Here are just a few. Today, head of the federal agency that protects whistleblowers sued the administration for illegal termination. Labor unions sued the acting director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau over an order to shut down most of that agency's work. A federal judge blocked part of an order to shut down USAID, and multiple labor groups are suing to block the president's federal buyout program. That, which we just heard from Weijia Jiang, is on temporary hold by a federal judge's order. Skye Perryman joins me now. She is the president and CEO of the nonprofit legal group Democracy Forward. Skye, it's great to have you with us.
Good to see you.
I've covered lots of tussles between the branches of government for years. And this is not the first White House to assert broad executive authority. The George W. Bush White House did through sort of a unitary executive idea. Does this feel like a fundamentally different kind of tussle over what Congress can do, what the courts can do, and the powers that this particular White House is trying to invest within it?
Well, certainly this White House is really operating completely outside of the bounds of anything that we've seen before, taking a number of positions that federal judges across the country have had to block or stop, including federal judges who, of course, were appointed by presidents of the president's own party. So this is not at this point something that you can chalk up to ideology or things like that. It's really about our basic constitutional order, our federal laws, and the way in which this administration is operating to the detriment of people and of communities, but also really in the throes of the law.
From your vantage point, Skye, what would be the clearest example of operating outside institutional norms of presidential power?
We have seen so many. I mean, with the stroke of a pen, this is a president that sought to take away constitutional protections from people with respect to birthright citizenship, where you're seeing every federal judge that has considered it and issued an order has had to temporarily block that because presidents don't get to change the Constitution with the stroke of a pen. We saw an abrupt attempt to discontinue essential services across this country, funding for programs like Head Start and Meals on Wheels, programs that are, by the way, very critical across the country, including in red areas, not just in blue areas, in rural areas, not just in large cities, that our team had to go into court and stop, and that has been put on hold. We've seen a range of other attacks on the nonpartisan and independent nature of our civil service and also of the First Amendment. This administration seeking to prioritize one ideology over another, which is really also in the throes of our First Amendment freedoms as Americans.
So there are legal challenges to this idea of a federal buyout, telling federal workers if you want to retire, you'll be paid until September. Some 65,000 have apparently signed up for this out of a federal workforce, just over 2 million. Some Americans might say, well, if they want to take the buyout, why not?
Well, look, I think that this really raises a range of issues really for the American people, not just for our civil servants. Over 90% of people in the United States, according to recent polling, believe that our government and people that work in our government should be promoted on their own merit, not because of loyalty to a particular political ideology or loyal to a particular, political perspective. But yet this administration is really seeking to hollow out our civil service. What they've done with the so-called fork in the road buyout is they're essentially proposing something that is not within the bounds of the law. The president does have some authority to manage the federal workforce, but he doesn't have the authority to engage in arbitrary behavior, which is what we have seen here, I believe is one of the reasons why you're seeing this on hold. In addition to that, this buyout, so-called, it promises money for federal employees. It has not been appropriated by Congress. And so we have a lot of concerns on behalf of federal employees and on behalf of the American people that that really rely on the work of federal employees about what the administration is doing here.
There were legal challenges to the administration's effort to close down the U.S. Agency for International Development, and they were blocked. And the judge asked the White House attorneys or the Justice Department for proof to back up its allegations of corruption, which it said was the reason why the agency needed to be shut down. The Justice Department did not provide any proof of that. What does that tell you?
Well, again, and this is one of our cases that we're pleased to litigate alongside our brave clients and then alongside our co-counsel at Public Citizen. But in this case, a federal judge could not find the substantiation that the government was making. Again, it shows you that this is an executive branch and a president that seeks to place themselves not only above the law, but also above the American people. And so that's what our team is really working to do, is to make sure that when these things happen, there are legal challenges brought. We do believe the courts are a real front line in the work to protect the rights of the American people and to protect our Constitution.
Skye Perryman, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Here's some words: tough, energetic, focused, effective. That's how a majority of Americans have so far described President Trump in our newest poll. Anthony Salvanto will dive into the numbers behind those words. That's next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. Isn't this exciting? We have our first look at how Americans across the country view President Trump's, I think it's fair to describe, flurry of actions since returning to the White House, Trump 2.0. 70% say he's doing what he promised on the campaign trail. Now, that's quite separate from whether they approve of what he's doing. They just find it consistent. But so far, a majority say, at least at the margins, they like what they see. CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, your friend and mine, Anthony Salvanto, joins us now. Anthony, tell us what you found.
Hey there, Major. So, look, there's political value in people feeling like you are delivering what you said you would. You're correct that not everybody who says that approves, but it does net out to this 53% approval. So net positive, and also, frankly, for context, higher than anything we recorded for him in his first term. Now, look, you mentioned in the tease there some of these descriptors. We measured some of these during the campaign. And what I always like to do, especially at the start of an administration, is compare, okay, what did people say during the campaign? What are they saying now at the outset? And a lot of these, he got good numbers on during the campaign, but you described it tough, energetic, focused. All of those things, they say them now, and it gives you that overall impression, as people get a general sense of direction, that things are happening, and that's netting out to that positive approval rating, Major.
How about one of the big issues of the campaign? Inflation, cost of living, et cetera.
Well, let's talk about that, and I want to do it in the context of tariffs. And here's what I mean. When you talk about what the administration is focused on, one of the things that stands out is perhaps a gap between what people were expecting and what they're seeing right now is this 2/3 who say not enough focus yet on lowering prices. You will recall inflation was a big, maybe the big, reason that Donald Trump won this election, and a lot of his supporters felt like he would lower prices. Now, they tell us in the poll they don't think that will happen overnight. Might take 6 months, might take a year. But I'm going to bring up tariffs here for this reason, because you do see a majority on the idea of tariffs against, allies, Mexico, Europe, Canada. You get majorities in opposition. And why? Well, because big numbers think tariffs would lead to higher prices. So they're sensitive to that. And that's one of those things to watch, what they're expecting and what they see they're getting, at least early on, Major.
Anthony, when the president muses about why he won the election, he often says immigration. What does our polling data tell us about that so far?
Well, that is a great example of a place where we find what we saw in the campaign, positive approval of the idea at the time of having a new program to deport immigrants who are in the U.S. illegally. And today we find majority approving of that program, as well as sending U.S. troops to the border. So that's one big policy where he does find majority approval.
Anthony Salvanto, always a pleasure, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Vice President Vance lands in Europe for an artificial intelligence summit. This after questioning at some level the authority of the U.S. judicial system. Our reporter panel will discuss those comments and a lot more when we come back. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. Vice President J.D. Vance is attending an artificial intelligence conference in France. While there, he's also set to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Our Olivia Rinaldi has the latest.
Vice President J.D. Vance kicked off his first international trip of the administration today by landing in Paris this morning with his family. Now, Vance is here to attend the Artificial Intelligence Action Summit. And what it is it's really a first-of-its-kind summit between world leaders, top tech executives, and policymakers from all around the globe to talk about the impacts of artificial intelligence ranging from numerous issues from healthcare to global security. Now, Vance spent the first part of the day after he landed at the ambassador's residence, and then he attended a working dinner with other heads of states, and we are told that tomorrow he's expected to actually address the gathering. After that, he's going to hold several bilateral meetings, and those will be with the head of the European Union, as well as Indian Prime Minister Modi, who's actually co-hosting the summit. Now, earlier in the week before he attended the summit, Vance told Breitbart News that he plans to use his time here not only to talk to European leaders about artificial intelligence, but also how to bring the conflict between Russia and Ukraine to a close. Now, after Paris, we expect Vance to head over to Munich, where he'll attend that annual security conference there. And while there, we can report that he plans to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Back to you.
Olivia Rinaldi, thank you so much, coming to us from Paris. Dave Weigel and Sabrina Rodriguez join me now here at the table. Dave is a politics reporter for Semaphore, Sabrina, a national political reporter for the Washington Post. You've read this. I just want to read this to the audience. Over the weekend, the vice president posted this on social media. Quote, if a judge tried to tell a general how to conduct a military operation, that would be illegal. If a judge tried to command the attorney general on how to use her discretion as a prosecutor, that's also illegal. Judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. Dave, that has, well, as you well know, provoked kind of a low-level outrage among those who are Democrats, progressives, liberals, saying this sounds authoritarian to them.
Yes, legitimate's a load-bearing word in that paragraph. I think
it absolutely is.
It will be up to what Sam Alito thinks is legitimate power and what isn't. That's the goal of all these suits. Not to be too dismissive of any of them, but this is the first time as president, because he got Amy going to get out in the court at the end of his last term. First time he's got a 6-3 conservative majority. It's going to have the chance to revisit a lot of precedents that Republicans have, not every Republican, but the sort of anti-New Deal Republicans have wanted to get rid of for 80 years. And they've already had some success in getting rid of some precedents that everyone, if you take a walk down D.C. and bump into a lawyer, they'll tell you was going to stand. It didn't.
Right. Mm-hmm. And Sabrina, whatever this is, it does appear to be a rather intense conversation, possibly clash, between the judicial branch, the legislative branch, and the executive branch about who has primacy.
Absolutely. I mean, this is what checks and balances is for. Now we're going to be doing a strength test, I think, on the checks and balances. I think hearing, it wasn't just J.D. Vance's tweet. I think seeing what Elon Musk has been tweeting in the last couple of days, thinking, what Donald Trump himself has said. I think it was striking him yesterday ahead of going to the Super Bowl. He on Air Force One said, and I quote, "No judge should be allowed to make that kind of decision. It's a disgrace." So there are some alarms going off for legal experts. I mean, they are questioning, are we going to be entering a constitutional crisis?
Are we going to be entering a place where the executive says, yes, a judge issued a ruling, but we're not going to follow it?
Where they say in advance that we're not going to follow it, as opposed to, did Obama get reversed a lot? Did Biden get reversed a lot? Yes, but it came after.
Upon reversal, they acknowledged and adhered.
Yes, and that's the difference.
That's the great question that's hanging in the air.
Yeah, we're towing the line here right now. They're stepping into questioning this authority. They're stepping in questioning on the judicial branch and on what checks and balances really represents for this country and this democracy. But we haven't entered into it yet. Right now, it's just Donald Trump posturing, Republicans posturing. And at the end of the day, I mean, we do oftentimes hear Trump make very bombastic statements. So it's a question of, is he ultimately going to move forward and try and, not adhere to one of these orders?
All three of us at this table pay very close attention to language and its underlying meaning. Dave, as you know, and you saw last week, so did you, Sabrina, President said over and over again, USAID has to be shut down because it's corrupt. Kickbacks. Then, when the judge said, well, please, Justice Department, provide evidence to back that up, none provided. This seems to me to be where you can test what the intentions are and what the underlying justifications may or may not be.
Yeah, and the White House has also played very loose with what grants they're even complaining about. I was one of the several reporters who last week or 2 weeks ago, after they started talking about how funding was going to family planning in Gaza, knowing that Israel doesn't allow family planning materials to go to Gaza, a lot of us called around. They had made up a $50 million outlay, and Trump doubled that to $100 million. So whenever they talk about foreign aid, this is a frustration to people who are in that department out of work right now. That it doesn't even matter if they can prove that their grant was doing something. If they're in the middle of a clinical trial, the premise is, well, this shouldn't exist. It might lead to corruption. And it's really, this is where you see this coalition Trump built between the sort of RFK Jr., anti-deep state, anything that might be broadcasting American power abroad is bad, and the traditional conservatives saying, well, it's a government program, so we'd love to get rid of it.
And Sabrina, we've all learned that through repetition and exaggeration, the president drives a message, whether there's any underlying validity to that at all, which then has a larger political consequence.
Absolutely. I mean, Major, one of the things here that I think is key is the courts are not the fastest. I mean, if we talk about an initial court order, appeals process, I mean, getting some of these cases to move up to which we expect inevitably to be the Supreme Court is going to take a while. But Donald Trump is talking about it, and Elon Musk is talking about it, and Republicans are talking about it. And what we've seen Trump do effectively since his time joining politics is chipping away at public confidence in institutions. He's done it when he talks about the media over all these years. He's done it when talking about the Justice Department and saying how it's been weaponized against people. So I think hearing him talk about the courts in this way, talking about judges in specific cases here, is something that is going to chip away for folks that are not tuned into Washington 24 hours a day, don't fully know, the ins and outs of how an order works. And he's going to be able to chip away at that by saying, you see, I had this mandate to do all these things, and they're not letting me do it.
And briefly to your point, Sabrina, when the general public, not tuned in, not following every turn of the screw, sees that lawyers and people in D.C. are upset, they're like, oh, Trump must be onto something, right?
100%. I mean, that's part of the plan here.
Dave, you've done some interesting reporting on how Democrats are or are not positioning themselves, posturing themselves, trying to find a voice.
They are, and this is where you hear the years of legal training in their heads as they try to articulate this in a way that appeals to people beyond the Beltway. I've heard a couple arguments we all have from as Democrats make these cases. Because the question they get all the time is, are you going to use the debt limit or a government funding deadline to force some change you want? And they keep saying, well, we don't run anything. The way that hits activists, a lot of activists, is that they're not even trying to stop anything. The way that sounds to them is that they don't want to own, they don't want to own any part of what Trump is going to do, because they're eventually going to come up to a funding deadline and realize they're $2 trillion short, let them deal with it. And the rest of their resistance is, you start to see Democratic strategists, some of them bolder than others, say they're not picking the right targets. The reason that the OMB freeze was bad politics is because you had people calling congressional offices saying, I don't know where my Head Start funding is coming from. Is this program affected, et cetera? And that is the thing about USAID. Unpleasant to hear if you work there. But for most, you've seen the polling. People vastly overestimate how much we spend on foreign aid and assume if you got rid of it, we could be funding every veteran's health care forever.
That's
not how it works, but that's why it's popular.
That's why they feel it. Dave Weigel, Sabrina Rodriguez, always great to have you at the table. Thanks so much. Dozens of countries are holding billions or even trillions of dollars in what are known as sovereign wealth funds. They're not new, but they are something that might be new in our country. President Trump has signed an executive order to put that in motion to maybe create a sovereign wealth fund here. We'll find out some of the underlying details about that initiative next. Welcome back. Thanks for hanging out with us. Tucked into the stack of more than 50 executive orders President Trump has signed is a plan to create here in the United States a sovereign wealth fund. What exactly is it? Where does the money come from? And what are the political, economic implications? Here to help us understand that and others, Arishi Iyengar, staff writer at Foreign Policy. So, for those who have maybe heard of it but don't know how to define it, what's a sovereign wealth fund?
So a sovereign wealth fund, those who have heard of it may be most familiar with are the ones in Norway or many of the Gulf states such as Kuwait, Saudi Arabia.
If you're a golf fan, you might have heard of the Public Interest Investment Fund, PIF.
Absolutely.
Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund.
Yeah, absolutely. So generally, these are sort of investment vehicles
that governments create
in order to invest in. It could be financial assets. It could be sort of real, tangible, physical assets like tech companies. So the PIF, the Saudi fund, which you just mentioned, for example, is an investor in Uber. They've bought up a bunch of soccer clubs in Saudi, one famous one in England, Newcastle United.
Right.
So it's sort of an effort, an initiative from the government to create a portfolio. And as one expert I spoke to put it, governments, when they spend, typically don't get upside. Think of sort of loans and grants that the U.S. does, say, under the CHIPS and Science Act, under the Biden administration. Those are grants given to companies, but then the companies get the upside. The sovereign wealth fund is, in a way, it's
making
a government
the government to be kind of a co-investor.
Exactly.
And in talking about this, the very afternoon that President Trump signed this executive order, he wove into the conversation something about TikTok and a possible government partnership with that.
Yeah.
That might be one of the ways these come together, if it's actually created.
Right, absolutely.
There's a long way to go, but he mentioned that.
He did mention that, and the saga of TikTok has obviously been a long-running one from his first administration to now. He has given them a stay of execution, if you will, on getting banned in the United States, and they have to find a U.S. buyer within 75 days of when he signed that order. So that creates all sorts of complicated legal questions. TikTok is a social media company, and does that mean that the U.S. government is getting involved very directly in a way that kind of determines what people see and hear? There's all sorts of First Amendment questions. There's content moderation. TikTok's a social network like Facebook, like Instagram. Does the government get involved in that? So there's more, sorry to use the cliche, but there's more questions than answers at this point.
And sovereign wealth funds, getting back to that, as I understand them, the governments who have them usually have surpluses upon which to provide some of the financial backing.
Right.
Anyone who knows anything about America's fiscal situation knows we don't run surpluses right now. We have this very large $37 trillion debt load, et cetera. How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's the question, frankly. So the Gulf states I mentioned, they typically have huge oil surpluses, energy surpluses that they then use to fund this. The other model is kind of China has a couple of sovereign wealth funds, or Singapore, where they fund it with excess foreign reserves that they have, and they have budget surpluses. The U.S. hasn't had one of those since 2001.
Right.
So there are sort of three ways it could potentially fund it, two of which Trump has kind of mentioned offhand. One is just by taking on more debt, which is problematic for very obvious reasons.
More debt means higher interest rates.
Right. Absolutely. And given,
to oversimplify, but yes.
Yeah, but given Trump's focus on lowering interest rates, could potentially pose a big problem for his administration. Secondly, it's, and this is something President Trump has mentioned, it's by through tariffs and taxes. He's mentioned tariffs specifically, which has been another big policy talking point, and the sort of tariffs he's already imposed on China, the tariffs he imposed and then pulled back temporarily on Canada and Mexico.
And the last one is assets here in the United States.
Yeah, so
physical assets.
Right, absolutely. And they mentioned that specifically in the fact sheet that accompanied the executive order, that the United States has $5.7 trillion in assets. But again, it's unclear what the roadmap is to selling those, which ones can be sold, how would you sell them, and whether you can do it without congressional approval, for that matter, or even stand up a fund like this in the first place without congressional approval. So
more questions than answers, but some pretty good answers. Rishi Iyengar, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
President Trump likes to boast about, well, you know, how he did with young voters in the 2024 election. There's some reason for him to boast that way. Well, the co-chair of the GOP Youth Advisory Council, he joins me here next. You're watching America Decides.
Someday, in 30 years from now, 40 years from now, 50 years from now, some of these young people are going to say, I remember Donald Trump, he did a good job. He set us on his way. He told us, he gave us a path.
President Trump, well, he likes to describe himself as a champion of young voters, and he credits a wave of Republican podcasters, social media influencers for the support that grew for him in the 2024 election. One of those influencers, C.J. Pearson, he joins me now here at the table. C.J. is also a GOP Youth Advisory Council co-chair. It's great to meet you.
Thank you for having me.
Tell me about your journey in politics. How did you become a Trump supporter and advocate?
Well, I got started in politics when I was just 12 years old, making YouTube videos in my parents' home, who are lifelong Democrats. So it's kind of an ironic journey to the Republican Party. But in supporting President Trump, I was attracted to his strength. This is a man who leads from behind and not from, who leads from the front and not from behind. And it's something that I respect a lot. When it comes to our future in this country, I trust him. I believe in him. I'm confident in him. And so do many of my peers. That's why we see in this new CBS News poll, we see a 10-point plus favorability rating among young people, even bigger than his favorability rating among baby boomers, which I think is an incredible testament to the fact that we believe and are confident in President Trump's vision for this country and this new golden age that he's ushered in.
Describe for me the conversation in your group of friends, your cohort of people who look at Trump and see something different than they saw before in politics.
I think what we're seeing now from young people is this, it's no longer a faux pas to support President Trump. It's no longer a faux pas to be MAGA. It's actually cool to do so. When I look at my peers,
when did it start to become cool?
I think this election cycle, with the president embracing influencers, embracing celebrities, you have folks like Kodak Black, Waka Flocka, all these big rappers, cultural figures, sensations coming out and saying, I support President Trump. I believe in his vision for America. I believe his economic agenda. It's no longer, cancel culture is dead, and he wrote the obituary for it.
How much of this is driven by being known by your enemies? President Trump is known by his enemies. Yeah. He talks about that all the time. Is that a driving force for you and your friends?
You know, I think for me, at the end of the day, you know a lot about a person based on their enemies. And I think a lot of his enemies are people that are enemies of our generation. Under President Biden, inflation was a record high. College affordability was nowhere to be found. Access to home buying was something not even being talked about. Under President Trump, we see an economy that is not just in recovery, but an economy that is humming and booming.
That was in the first term. In the first term.
In the first term, and I think we're going to see it again here. We've had a president who right out the gate has had one of those successful 3 weeks that we've ever seen in American history. We're excited about what's to come, and I'm rooting for him.
When you encounter those in your peer group who are not for Trump, who are decidedly against the president, how do those conversations go?
You know, I think they're respectful and they're cordial, and I think that a lot more people are coming over to him. And honestly, I don't have those conversations all too often these days. And I think it's in large part because of the fact the president's track record speaks for himself. Under President Biden, we understand those two worlds. Under President Biden, we didn't have hope. We felt destitution. We didn't have the optimism that we're experiencing right now. But right now, in just a few short days, we have seen that all turn around, and we're super excited about what's to come.
And how much of the kind of things that President Trump did during the campaign that struck maybe people of my generation as kind of odd, the sneakers, the gold sneakers,
the
McDonald's, the getting on the trash truck. Look, some of us looked at that and might have said to themselves, either that looks like old-style politics or he's trying to get to something, but he's not quite there. How did that land in your world?
Well, President Trump is in a league of his own, and I think he knew that what he had to do to win this election was to reach America's young people where they are, and that's exactly what he did. It's why he
How does McDonald's reach them where they are?
He became a meme, and he went viral. So he didn't have to go through the traditional media to reach them. He went through podcasters. He went through influencers, and that won him the day. And unlike Kamala Harris, he didn't sit down with these manufactured conversations about political issues that didn't really matter to people. He sat down and was his authentic self. He sat down with Theo Vaughn and Joe Rogan and just really, you know, shot it with them. And it was so incredible to see. And I think that's what we need to see more of. More people want authenticity from their politicians, not manufactured ones.
What to you is the core of authenticity? Is it to say things that make people upset, or to be yourself the same way all the time, every time?
I think it's to say what you mean and do what you say. That's exactly what President Trump has done. Promises made and promises kept, I think, define the entire first beginning of this administration.
And is there any other politician in Republican ranks that comes close in your mind?
Vivek Ramaswamy, I think, is killing it. I think Vivek.
But he's not a politician right now.
Well, I think he will be soon. I think looking like he's going to be running for governor. So, but I think he also helped revolutionize this new way of reaching young people, going to where they are, using alternative media, not just talking to your typical cable news hosts and whatnot, but actually reaching people where they are increasingly, which is on social media.
Very quickly, RFK Jr., does he fit into that category?
Make America healthy again, baby.
DJ Pearson, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you so much.
That does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report, well, that starts right now.